Good evening, and welcome to the fourth of our Thursday night town hall meetings. This has been a great opportunity for me to get a chance to hear from you and also to share with you some of the ideas and some of the issues that are important to the people of District 56. This evening, we had planned on having a guest, and I had shared with you last week that we were going to have a guest, and we were going to be talking about racism. And unfortunately, we weren't able to, she was not able to join us. So as we get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Richard Tucker, and I'm running for District 56 Senate seat here in Minnesota. And I think it's time that we have a discussion about racism because it is the topic that has been on the minds of everybody around this country and around the world for the last 2 weeks. And so, as I said, we were going to have a guest, and she was going to be someone that was going to be able to give us a perspective that is unique and not one that I share. And what I mean by that is she was a Black woman raising a young Black man in Burnsville High School. That's not a path and a journey that I have taken. So I wanted to hear her side of it. So as we go through this, I think there's a place to start. And the place to start with it is, what is racism? What do we mean by that? What's the common definition? And so let's start with Merriam-Webster's definition of racism. And I'm going to read that to you because I want to make sure I get it correct. It's a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capabilities, and racial differences produce inherent superiority of a particular race. And for so many people, well, if I didn't believe that, well, therefore I'm not a racist. And I think there are a lot of people who were comforted in their own minds by simply saying that. But the reality is, we need to ask the people who are impacted by racism, what do they think it means? What does it mean to them? And a young lady wrote to Merriam-Webster's and said, you know, the definition that you use is not a really accurate one for what we experience. And they agreed. And they said, yes, we need to make that change. And so they're looking at it from and rewriting that definition to take into account more of the historic, systemic racial issues that we have in this country. So as we go down this path and we start talking about that, one of the things that we have to recognize is that we have a problem. And when I say we, I'm talking about me as a Caucasian white man. We have created a problem, and it is up to us to fix it. And as somebody who's running for office, you have a right to understand where I stand, what are the things I'm going to fight for, what I believe in, and where we can go with this. So as I begin to talk about this and we look at the situation of the murder of George Floyd, and it triggered something in this country, which I would like to say that we've never seen before. But unfortunately, we have seen it before. We've seen it time and time and time again. And unfortunately, we have not addressed the problems that creep back up. And because of that, we're back in this position. Now, there's a lot of people out there that hope and believe that this time is going to be different, that we're going to embrace these changes and we're going to move forward. And there were a lot of young people who were engaged and involved this time that maybe weren't involved in the past. But I've been around a long time and I have seen these things happen, and we have failed repeatedly to make the changes that we need to make. Even in the midst of the conversations around police violence and police brutality, we had examples in protests of police using force unnecessarily. We had two boys in Tulsa arrested for jaywalking. They put in handcuffs over jaywalking. That's not a life experience that I would have. I have jaywalked plenty of times in my life. I have never been arrested, and I've certainly never been put in handcuffs over jaywalking. But that tells you that the journey that I walk is different than they walk, and that's why we need to make the changes. White men created these policies. We need to step into and fix the policies. And this is, when we look at what we did, the systemic part of what we did, it's a housing issue, it's a employment issue, it's a gun safety issue, it's a healthcare issue, it's an education issue. Those issues are the ones that we have to address if we're going to fix this. It isn't any one thing. So much of the time, I think we like to think that, well, if we do this one simple thing, it will fix the problem. It is not one simple thing. Systemic racism is, by its definition, everywhere. And it is in all aspects of our life and society. So what that means is it isn't any one simple thing that we can do to fix it either. It will require sustained engagement, community engagement, one-on-one conversations, larger conversations. It requires listening to the people who are involved, listening to the people whose stories have been impacted by this. That's the only way that we begin to understand how the systems that we have put in place, how they impact the people of color and our indigenous people, and then how do we begin to fix those. But it isn't any one piece of legislation. When I said earlier, it's education. Education disproportionately affects the system that we have, disproportionately affects people of color because they tend to be in schools that don't have the financial resources in order to offer them the tools and resources necessary to succeed. When we look at the redlining and housing, we kept people from being able to buy houses, which meant we instituted generational poverty, because the fastest way to accumulate wealth is through housing. As a realtor, I happen to know that. And so that's one of those things that we created was redlining, and then the inability to finance for people in those houses. So we've created that problem. We have the education problem. Healthcare is unaffordable. And we've created a problem because if we look at the experiences around COVID-19, again, it is disproportionately affecting people of color. So we look at that, then we look at employment, and we recognize that we have a disproportionate and disparate situation in terms of people getting pay equity. So all of these are pieces of this puzzle. It is, I said, it isn't any one thing, and it has to be dismantled brick by brick, piece by piece. And the reality is we need to go back and recognize that at the core, this goes back to, quite frankly, our original sin as a country. We actually have two original sins, I think, as a country. One is slavery. One is what we did to our indigenous people. But both of those, and they both happened at essentially the same time. If you go 1619, 1620, two different events, but essentially the beginning of that process. And we have yet to fully accept responsibility, fully accept acknowledgement, and fully recognize it. How do we move forward on that? So as a senator in this district, what would I do? Where do I stand? What are the things that are important to me? I believe we have to fix the healthcare system to decouple it from employment. We need to move in a direction of a single payer system. I will fight for that. We need to look at fully funding the school systems so that all of the resources are necessary across the entire spectrum. And that means we look at the state stepping up and putting dollars into the school systems across the board. And that has to happen, and I will fight for that. If we look at the systems that we're talking about in terms of housing, if you want to understand how that came about, there's a great program called the Mapping Project, or Mapping Prejudice, rather. And it talks about and explains what protective covenants existed, which kept people of color from buying homes in neighborhoods. That was real, it existed, and it has to be, we have to get rid of it. Now, we don't have that anymore today because it's been outlawed, but we need to look at that from the perspective of financing as well. That's in Minneapolis. But as we look at our district here, what are some of the other things that I would do to fight for as we move in the direction of trying to make sure? Part of it, we look at it from a policing point of view. The caucus, the People of Color and Indigenous People Caucus, has put together a number of recommendations around policing and what can we do to do a better job in transparency, in accountability, in use of force. All of that has to be done. But this is not a bashing the police, attacking the police, because the policeman asked to do way too much. So this is not that question. It is all of the other pieces, and we need to address each one of them individually and then work collectively. But we can't do that if we're not listening and engaging and talking to people, and that is a requirement, and we have to do that. So as your senator, those are the things that I would fight for. Those are the issues and challenges that we have to take on. There were a couple of questions that I got earlier, and so I want to take a second and touch on a couple of those. One of the questions was, how do I do a better job listening to people? One of the ways that you can do that is to educate yourself, and you can educate yourself by reading. The New York Times bestseller list right now, and I'll post that to the website, but the New York Times bestseller list right now, the top 10 books are all books to help you see the world through a different set of eyes, through the eyes of somebody who has experienced racism. There literally are 10 great books on there right now, top 10 books. Read one, read two, read them all, but educate yourself and try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's the only way you ever get an understanding and from a different perspective. I recognize that the journey I've traveled as a white man is completely different than a close friend of mine who is a black woman, and she and I have had many conversations over the years, and the reality is my journey is different than hers, and I'll never fully understand her journey because I haven't walked it. I haven't experienced the things that she's experienced. And I'll tell you a little quick story about how subtle some of this racism can be. There was a story the other day on the news. There were 6 doctors that were on a Zoom conference call. And the person who was heading up the conference call called on each one of the doctors, Dr. So-and-so, could you give your perspective on that? Dr. So-and-so, could you give your perspective? There was one black woman who was a doctor, but he didn't address her as doctor. He addressed her by her first name. Now, you wouldn't think on the overall context that that was racist, but what that did is it undercut her legitimacy, her credibility. It completely undercut that. And yet on the surface, you wouldn't necessarily pick that up, but that's exactly what that did. So those are some of the subtle things that you have to be careful about. One of the other questions that was asked to me goes to the statues and the questions around the statues and symbols that are being taken down and creating questions and controversy. Should we be erasing our history? So let me give you a real quick sense of my position on that. Statues are built to honor and celebrate people. When we build statues to Confederate generals and Confederate soldiers in the South, we build them to honor them. Why would we build statues to honor people who fought against this country? There are no statues of Rommel in Germany. There are no statues of Hitler in Germany. And yet they haven't erased their history. The way they remember their history is Dachau. That's how they remember the history of Second World War. So we're not erasing our history by taking those down. History books are a great place to relive and tell that story, the fact that slavery was wrong. So putting those statues up, all that does is remind people that, oh, this was a wonderful thing at one point in time. It wasn't. And those statues need to come down because all they do is remind people that this was something we thought was a good idea. It was a horrible idea, and we have to take the statues down. So I'm unequivocal about that. I'm looking to see if we had some other questions. I have another question called the 13th Amendment. Eric has brought to my attention, there's a great Netflix series or a Netflix show called The 13th Amendment, and talks about the history of slavery. I would encourage you to go do that. It's a great way to listen and understand and put yourself in somebody else's perspective. So going back, what does it mean to fix these? Here's the big challenge, and this is the thing. We've said all this before. We've gone down this path before. We've had these conversations. I go back to 1968. I can remember when Martin Luther King was killed. We had these conversations. and we didn't do anything. And we've had them throughout my lifetime. We've had these conversations and we have had these protests, and we have not stepped up and done that. Part of it is, I think, is maybe this is different, is that we have finally, maybe not finally, but hopefully acknowledged that we, white America, has created systemic racism, and it is up to white America to fix systemic racism. And as I said, it is one brick at a time, one engagement at a time, one conversation at a time. So I think as I move forward down this path, the best way for me to learn is to listen to those engaged. And let's all do that together. Find opportunities to listen, find opportunities to ask questions. Don't listen from the perspective of how do I respond? Listen to hear. Listen so that you're really sincerely trying to understand, not to rebut, but to understand somebody else's perspective. Because if we don't understand someone else's perspective, we will never begin to put the changes in place that we have to do. We are so long overdue with this. It is not even funny. And when the overriding thing that I've heard from people throughout this is, we're tired. Boy, they have every right to be tired. Fed up and tired. This is far too long. And so as we move forward, as we go down this path, this isn't the last conversation we're going to have. And so I certainly hope not. It is an ongoing process of learning and listening together. As someone who's running for this office, you need to know that I will fight to bring down every single brick of institutional systemic racism that exists. And I will work tirelessly across the entire spectrum to do that. And it's a promise and a commitment that I make to you as we move forward, so that there's no misunderstanding as to where I stand or what is important to me as a senator. With that, and I think I've expounded probably long enough and loud enough, but I wanted to be sure, and I wanted to be clear, and I wanted to make sure we begin this process of having this conversation. But this conversation will come up when we talk about gun safety. This conversation will come up when we talk about healthcare. This conversation will come up when we talk about education, because it is part of the fabric of our society, and it is one of those things that we have to address, and we are long past time to do it. And I'm sure there are people out there saying, I have heard this all before. Well, I apologize for that, but we need to get going, and we need to make these changes. And so I ask for you for your support. I ask for your vote. I ask for your donations, because it is critical. If I'm going to step forward and lead in this area for you, I need your support. Go to tuckerformnsenate.com to donate. Go to tuckerformnsenate.com to be part of the campaign. I really appreciate your help. I appreciate your support. Please reach out to me with questions, with opportunities to sit and engage and listen, because right now we need to do a lot of that. And I pledge to you, I will do that as we move forward. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time this evening and look forward to next week. Next week, I will not be here on my regular schedule, because the climate change is going to have a Facebook Live event, and I've been invited to participate in that. It's an opportunity to listen to all of the Senate candidates, including the incumbent, and we're going to talk about climate change and how we address that. That's next week, and so you won't find me on my page. You'll find me on the Climate Change Facebook Live, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for your time this evening, and with that, I'm going to sign out.